welcome. I'm Olas Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Today we're talking about deoccupation and reintegration of the information space of Crimea, what international legal and media communication instruments should be used by Ukraine's government to tackle this issue. To talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today by Yulia Kazdobina, an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Information Policy. Hello and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here again. So as far as I understand, Ukraine focuses mainly on its information campaign and proper information strategy in order to properly reintegrate the occupied territories. Am I right?
Well, information strategy is, or rather communication strategy is one of the components. But Ukraine has declared that it's going to use primarily diplomatic and political means to free Crimea from occupation, and so.
But this is one of the main ones, the information and the
information. Yes, is one of the components of Ukraine's policy, and I think it's at this point it's not most, but it's. It's been formulated and it's been embodied in a document adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers at the end of the last year, the Strategy for Information Reintegration of Crimea, and currently the Ministry is working on the action plan for the strategy, so that the strategy is a framework document and it needs a list of specific steps that need to be taken.
Okay, so the Ministry is working on the plan. Do we know anything about this plan? Do we have any concrete steps so far? Because I wanted to ask you about the implementation of this strategy, but I see that now we have to choose how to implement it.
Well, one of the important directions in which the Ministry and some other government agencies have been working on for several years is the development of broadcasting infrastructure, and that's building up of broadcasting towers and issuing licenses to broadcasters, TV and radio broadcasters, those who would be able to reach residents of Crimea, because after the occupation, all the ties have been severed. And so that's one of the important aspects. But then we need to understand what messages we need to convey, and also we understand that a Crimean audience is only one of the audiences that we have to work with, and other two are international audiences and also Ukrainian audience, because...
And also even Russian audience. Yes.
But Russian audience is a lot harder to reach. That's true. Unfortunately.
Maybe they wouldn't choose to watch Ukrainian news outlets or to read Ukrainian news outlets.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Russian information space is pretty much closed in, and it's closing in even more. You probably know that they recently adopted this law on sovereign internet, and so we're going to have even fewer opportunities to reach Russia and Crimea, for that matter, as well, because it's under the Russian occupation.
Yes, this may be hard. This may result in the challenges to reach out to the Ukrainians living in Crimea and in Donbass. Speaking of this new broadcasters, signals, and building towers, I do understand that this is about television and radio, but speaking about mass media, according to Crimean human rights group, the occupational authorities in illegally annexed Crimea are massively blocking Ukrainian websites. Among them, we are speaking about 12 news outlets. There was a survey conducted in Crimea in February-March this year, and the activists checked the availability of 34 Ukrainian sites from 10 different Crimean providers. And all of these 10 different providers, they blocked 12 out of 34 Ukrainian news outlets, which actually shows us a pretty strong message that the information is being censored, people do not really have access to information, and they cannot maybe monitor what is going on in Ukraine, what is the actual reality, and what is the actual truth. So how can we tackle this issue? And if we're speaking about the broadcasters, signals, and towers, is it easy for Russia to block these signals, or can we spread our word in some other different ways?
Unfortunately, it is easy for Russia to block. Well, it's not easy, but Russia is blocking a lot of Ukraine's efforts. They've recently built another tower so there is one tower that was there prior to the occupation, the one that was used by Ukraine. It's located in Krasnoperikopsk, and they've built another one near Jankoy. That's another town in Crimea, and that was built specifically for the purpose of blocking signal from Ukraine. And so it really is a big issue of how you get through to the residents of Crimea, because Russia is limiting their access to alternative sources of information, and it is feeding them propaganda messages and untrue information. And actually, when the information reintegration strategy for Crimea was adopted, I then went and looked at the way it was covered by Russian media and Crimean media, and they were just making fun of it. But that, okay, these Ukrainians, again, they just cannot accept the fact that Crimea is now Russian. But I think even that is a way of reaching a Crimean audience. They do know that Ukraine is doing something, and although the messages get there in a distorted way, still, those who wait for Ukraine to come back, they still get the message that Ukraine is doing something. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's communication with those people who travel from Crimea to Ukraine. And many people still, those who moved out of Crimea, and they still have relatives in Crimea, and so they communicate with them. I understand that probably that's not a very large audience, but at this point, that's what we have, unfortunately. And that's the reality.
We do clearly see that the occupational authorities are trying to advance the fake reality around Crimeans, and they are trying to create new identity for these people, new national, so to say, identity. And unfortunately, only 249 children have the Ukrainian language as the language of instruction in Russia-occupied Crimea. This information is according to the UN Monitoring Mission on Human Rights in Ukraine. In your opinion, how can we tackle this issue? Because back in 2013, 2014, we had about 12,000 kids studying in Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Crimea. We do realize that Crimea was the territory mainly Russian-speaking, with the Russian-speaking society, but still, this is Ukraine, this was Ukraine, and people who live there are Ukrainians. Can we maybe develop some online platforms for these kids who can study school subjects and school program in Ukrainian? Or maybe there are other ideas how to tackle this issue, how to, because we are about to lose these kids.
Well, one point, although this was a primarily Russian-speaking territory, there were several Ukrainian schools, and they were pretty competitive. It was not easy to get in, and so they provided pretty good education. And one of them was located in Simferopol, and unfortunately now it teaches mostly in Russian, but still, so Ukrainian, there was demand for the Ukrainian language. How can we tackle the issue? As far as I know, the Education Ministry is working on distance education for residents of the occupied territories, but...
this is interesting.
I don't know the details. I think you would need to talk to somebody who really works on this issue to tell you the details of this, but I know that there is an initiative like this. But still, if you think about kids in Crimea, it's an additional burden, right? If you want to study something in Ukrainian and at the same time study in the Russian school, it's an additional burden. And so only those who are really very patriotic and those who really want to go to Ukraine will probably choose to study in Ukrainian. It's a problem. So it's a problem. We need to provide this opportunity to them, but still we need to be realistic about it as well.
I understand. Well, if we were speaking about this year, 2019, what is planned for this year by the Ministry of Information Policy?
The ministry will continue working on its usual projects. Those are communication campaigns on certain dates, right? The one was in February of this year, the date when actually Ukrainians in Crimea rose against the Russian occupation. That was February 26, and we had a big forum with a pretty high-level attendance, including the U.S. Special Representative, the Kurt Volker, and the campaign on that date, and then the campaign on May 18th, information campaign May 18th. That's the date of the deportation of the Crimean Tatar people, and the date of Crimean Tatar journalism, date of the human rights date, which is a very important date for Crimea as well, when we need to inform people about the human rights violations that are taking place. Also publishing books and other brochures explaining the situation in Crimea, and also providing the actually fact-based story of Crimean history, because Russia claims that it has some sort of historical rights to Crimea, and those rights are based in factually untrue information. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to involve Ukrainian historians who have been studying Crimean history and publish books, those that are easily accessible to people in a readable format, and try to just distribute them throughout Ukraine. And that's a part of actually of the strategy of implementation, which is a part of building Ukraine's narrative on Crimea, because after the occupation came as a very big surprise, of course, to everybody, and so it took some time to get our act together, to understand what we can do about it, what are the opportunities, what are the limitations, and also
to decide on the actions and the action plan.
Actions, and then to communicate those actions to different audiences. And so the ministry is also going to work on this plan, and this is a very specific document which the government needs to coordinate its activities, and it's going to have some specific things that need to be done for because the government needs to at least put information on the resources it controls, right? Meaning the websites of the government bodies, and that should contain Ukraine's position on Crimea, maybe some updates on the situation on Crimea, Ukraine's policy on Crimea, and that's the first thing. And also try to coordinate actions of different ministries, because different ministries are involved in policy towards Crimea. The Ministry for Occupied Territories, the Foreign Ministry,
every ministry,
and some other bodies that are not executive branch. I mean, the Prosecutor's Office for Crimea.
Yes, well, from my personal opinion, I do hope that our Crimean audience has no interruptions in having signal with the UATV channel, and maybe whomever had any questions has found some answers from our interview. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us.
Thank you.
That was Yulia Kazdobina, an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Information Policy. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.